Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about something really exciting for me, and that is modifiers. Today, I want to talk about all of the modifiers that I use in my projects, and we're going to create some of the things that I will use in my thumbnail. That way, we're doing two things at once. I have 3.6 for Blender because the 4.0, the new one, is very slow for me. So I'm going to stick with this, but I will share with you, if you have the 4.0, I'll share with you the differences in modifiers, or the only difference that I found with modifiers. So if I add a cube to start with, so we can actually get the modifiers tab, and I go to the modifiers, you'll notice that I have for 3.6, that is if you never had 3.6 before or before the 4.0, this is going to be an open list that you can see everything in. But with the 4.0, it's a little different. It has a plus sign over here instead of the list icon. And once you click it, it gives you something like this that you can select from. And you can definitely search the modifier that you want if you know the name of it. So if you're following a tutorial, you can definitely search the name of it. So what I'm doing today is going to tell you the name of it, and you can just search for it and add it. It's going to be the same thing with the same settings, no problem. And also some of the settings in the modifiers is going to depend on whether you have this as supported for the render or experimental. I sometimes use experimental for adaptive subdivision, but today we're going to keep it as supported, and maybe we'll talk about experimental adaptive subdivision later on when we talk about textures and materials. Okay, so if I go to modifiers, one of my most used modifier is the subdivision surface. So if I go to over here, subdivision surface, you'll find it under generate if you're using the new 4.0 Blender, and that will create a subdivision in your cube, or a subdivision for each face, basically, which is exactly what you will do if you go into edit mode and hit subdivide, and that's what it will do. The only difference is that here you're subdividing, or in edit mode, you're subdividing with the equivalent of simple over here in the modifiers. So if I go to simple, then it is actually being subdivided, but it's not using this calculation. All I know is this gives you smoother results, but if you want something that will keep the shape of your objects, but will add a little bit more subdivision so you can displace it, or you can bend it, or you can do other things that you cannot do if you don't have enough subdivisions, then I would use simple. And sometimes with these modifiers, you can see the wireframe if you open it from the viewport overlays. So this is going to add an overlay over your object or over your geometry. And if I turn on the wireframe, we should be able to see the wireframe. The only thing is it doesn't work with everything. So with subdivision, it doesn't necessarily show me the changes in wireframe when it comes to this modifier. But if I do the remesh modifier, which is another one that I use quite often, which will allow you to see the wireframe change because it is drastic, and so it'll show you it. I don't know how to make this show over here because I think it would be helpful to show it. Probably there's a reason for why to not show it. And if you do sharp, you're going to see the difference, smooth as well. And you can actually see the difference if you remove the subdivision, because this calculation doesn't really give you equal quads or squares like the simple one. And if you add this subdivision after the remesh, sometimes it does show it. And even if you add this afterwards, it still doesn't show the subdivisions over here. So some of the modifiers are going to show you the change directly over here in terms of wireframe, or how it will look if you apply the modifiers. So if I apply the modifier for the remesh, it's going to look like this. But let's say I want to remove this, and let's say I want to apply this. Now if I apply it, we can actually see the change in wireframe. We can see the orange showing over here, and I can go and actually see the vertices that were added. But let's undo this and let's check another modifier. What I want to do with this cube is to bend it. And this is a modifier that I use whenever I want to bend something at a 45 or 90 degree angle. If I go into edit mode, I select this side, go to 7, hit G to move it because I want to make it longer, and then hit X to isolate the axis. Now I can select all with A, move it so it's centered, and now I want to bend it. we're going to have problems because I don't have enough subdivisions. But let's go to Simple Deform. And Simple Deform has a few things to use, but my most used one is Bend. So if I go to Bend, I want to bend it so it gives me the shape that they have for the icon for the Simple Deform. So what I need to do is add a subdivision right before that. And I need it to be simple. And now I'm starting to see a better bend, and I can add more. I don't want the bend to be on the x-axis. I want it to be on the z-axis. And now I can actually rotate it 90 degrees from the top view, so it's going to move it on the z-axis. I disabled the Simple Deform so I can actually see where it's laying, and then I'll turn it on again and do 90 degrees. And now I can rotate it so it fits what I want. And this is going to be my top left corner for my thumbnail. You can definitely add more subdivisions, but one thing you have to note is that the levels viewport is only showing here. So if you render this, it's going to be at level 2, so it's going to look like this. So be sure to have render either equal or higher than the levels viewport. So what I do sometimes, just so my viewport doesn't lag, is to keep the levels viewport lower, because now I know that it works and that I have enough levels at 4. Then I'm going to just reduce it over here and then put it at 4 over here. So when it's rendering, it does give me the look I want, but it's not slowing down my viewport. So far we have used the subdivision modifier and the Simple Deform. Now if I want to puff this up, what I would do is remesh it. What's nice about using modifiers is that it's non-destructive. So you can edit as much as you want, and then you can undo all of it just by removing these modifiers rather than increasing the number of undos or trying to undo and finding that you have gone past the number of undos that you're allowed, or something that is too destructive that you cannot really save unless you remove it and redo it all over again. If I'm using a destructive workflow, what I do is keep backups, but with modifiers, I don't really care about having backups because I know at any point I can just remove all of this. So right now with this, I get to have squares all over. So this way I can use the cloth modifier to puff this up and it'll look nice. But you can definitely change this from voxel to sharp, which is my favorite when it comes to something like this. And of course you will have to increase this a little bit for the viewport, especially if you're going to cache the inflation or the cloth modifier. And you can also use the smooth, and then you can use the subdivision surface right after as well. So you can stack as many as you want, but don't go overboard just because it will break your computer. It'll slow down your viewport, it will freeze Blender, and sometimes it'll crash it. I haven't had a crash in a long time without it being my mistake for doing something that I know I shouldn't have been doing. And so I overloaded my computer because I don't really have the strongest of computers. You can definitely do simple with this one, but I like to keep it at this so it gives me a softer look. But I like to add bevel right before it so it'll have these edges crisper. So if I go to bevel, which is right over here, and I put it right before subdivision. This way I have sharper edges. So if I disable bevel, you can actually see the difference. We had a full tutorial on beveling edges with edit mode and with a modifier, but there's one thing that I haven't talked about in that video, and it is limiting the bevel. And an important one to know, and I think I said that if you want to specify one edge or one vertex, you can do it in edit mode, but you can also do it in bevel. But it's a different process than that one. It's much easier to do it in edit mode, but if you want to do it with the modifiers because you are following a non-destructive workflow, then you can just limit it with a vertex group. And you can go to edit mode, let's say selecting these two corners, go into the object data and add a vertex group and call it bevel. I like to call them with the tools that I'm going to use them with, or the process that is going to be done to these vertices, and then assign. And if I go out of edit mode and I go to the modifiers, and now I can select the bevel group. But you'll have to know that with vertex groups, What you're selecting is what is happening before any of the modifiers. So let's say I'm disabling all of these just so we can actually see what is happening. And I'm only going to keep the bevel. Now we're actually seeing what is happening. Because these two are selected and they're connected, so there's nothing in between them to disconnect them, they're going to act as an edge as well. And what you're going to change over here is going to only change for that vertex group. But if I do angle, then it's going to change it for every vertex, or for every edge rather. If you're doing vertices, then it's going to do it for every vertex. And you actually see the difference when I add all of these. So simple deform isn't changing anything. Subdivision isn't changing that much. Oh, I wasn't in the vertex group limit method. So, okay, now we can actually see that it's only affecting this area, but it is displacing the mesh in a way that I don't like. If I add the remesh, it's not going to do anything then, because now the vertices are changing. With remesh, you're losing the vertex groups and you're losing your UV maps. So if you have UV maps before remesh, you're not going to have that. And when you use it in the materials, you're also not going to have that as an option. So the UV is going to be blacked out and it's going to be removed just because you have a completely different mesh right now. So the edges that you used to have are not there anymore. That's why bevel is not working anymore. So you have to also be aware of that. I just wanted to show you the limit method with vertex group, so you know that you don't only have the option to bevel when you're only in edit mode. And you can definitely do it before remesh, so you make sure that you have that. You can also do it before the simple deform, or even before the first subdivision, because that's the only way it actually works apparently. Also because the remesh doesn't have a lot of depth. Yeah, you can play around with it and see what happens. I'm going to remove the bevel and remove the last subdivision and the remesh because I don't really need it. Okay, so the only new one that we've learned today is simple deform. Another one that I have talked about before but haven't delved too deep into it is the solidify modifier. So if I go to add mesh, let's add a plane, and I'm going to add a vertex group for bevel, assign it, I'm going to add bevel, vertices, limit with vertex group because I want to make something resembling a door. And you can go to geometry, clamp overlap to make sure that it's not overlapping like this. So this will make sure that even if you go over, it's not going to go over. And I have 6 segments because I want it to look smoother, and we can even make this longer. Okay, so let's say I want this to have some depth because right now it doesn't really have anything. Let's actually just hide this so we can see what is happening with this door. So now I have this shape that I've modeled, and I want to, not sure what happened there, but I want to add a solidify modifier to it. Let's rotate it 90 degrees, go to front view, move it up. And you can also collapse all of these so you have more room for more modifiers, so you don't have to scroll all over. And let's increase the thickness. Now what you'll notice is that the thickness is only increasing at one side. So it's either going to the front if we're going negative or back if we're going positive. What you can do is make this a 0, and now it's actually doing it from the center. So if you centered something and you just want to increase its depth from the center, you can just change the offset. And the same thing for 1, it's going to offset the entire shape from its center point or from its origin. So this is 1, this is -1, which is the default, and I prefer 0. You can also do even thickness, but it doesn't work with something like this. If you have a lot of edges with different distances between the vertices, then you're going to need to turn on even thickness to make sure that it's calculating that. And then fill is going to fill the sides. So let's say you want to create 2 of the same thing without using an array. You can definitely use an array for this, but let's say you want to use thickness for it and you have a specific thickness, but you don't want to fill it. You would do that without the fill. But I never really use it this way. It's always with the fill. When it comes to only rim, it just removes the other edge. So it's only filling the rim and then it's leaving this empty. There are uses for this, of course, but I wouldn't want to use it this way personally. So I like to just use it with a fill completely, because what I'm trying to do is extrude without using extrude in edit mode. And then you can also offset the material. Just so you know, if you have multiple slots over here, so if you have 2 over here, these are slots for the same object, and then these are materials all together for the entire scene. And if you go over here and you said, I need the material offset to be not 0, but 1, so that way it's going to make the solidify a different color, a different material from the original shape that you have before the solidify. And you can do the same thing with bevel as well. So with shading, the material index is at -1, but you can do it at 0 or at 1. And I think it goes from 0, 0, 1 to how many slots you have. And that's how you offset the material. So you can have a different material from the modifiers menu based on how many slots you have. And you can also deal with vertex grips, but I don't really use it for solidify. This is the only way I would use solidify to extrude something without using extrude in edit mode. And then of course, I will use a subdivision surface like always. But before that, I like to add another bevel before that, so I keep the original shape. And if I add the segments, I can keep the sharp edges, and this way I can add subdivisions to the sides and to the front without ruining the actual shape, because if I remove this, it's ruining the shape. Or you can definitely do simple, but I like to add bevel right before the subdivision if I want to keep its edges. Another one that we can do after all of this is the wireframe. And I've talked about this before. I've used it in this project. I was able to create a bunch of baskets just by using the wireframe and subdivision modifiers. I knew what the wireframe did, and so I was just creating the edges for the baskets that I wanted. So any places where I wanted bigger holes, I dissolved some of the edges to make those shapes on the geometry bigger. And the parts that I wanted to be smaller, I subdivided, and then I added a wireframe and a subdivision surface for the softer ones. So what wireframe does is it grabs all of the edges in the shape and creates a wireframe. So if I do a wireframe for this, it's going to grab every edge and create a wireframe out of it. But because I have a subdivision that is creating these weird artifacts over here on the top, I'm going to have to add it before the bevel and the last subdivision. But then it does something even more weird. So maybe we can try it after the bevel, and that's even weirder. But the reason why is because of the subdivision. So if I remove the subdivision, we can actually see the initial wireframe, the wireframe that we were seeing in orange with this over here, the overlay of wireframe, as actual geometry. And you can even remove replace original to keep the original mesh. I wouldn't use wireframe with everything. It's usually with something that has a lot of quads to make things much easier for me, just like the basket, rather than just creating all of that one by one and removing all of the faces. I could just use a wireframe, and that will make it much easier for me to delete later if I change my mind. So it is a nice thing to use, but be careful where to use it. And knowing what the modifiers do will help you plan your project better when you start. I like to experiment first with the tool that I want to use, and then create a project that would work with that new tool that I've just learned. And you just saw how many errors I just got with the wireframe and trying to change its position just to figure out where is the best position for it. I know that it doesn't work that well after subdivisions, especially with this algorithm. So maybe if I've used simple, let's try it out. It's much better, but we still get artifacts over here. There is another one that I haven't put on my list, but that I use sometimes when I get something like this, which is weld. And what that does is it combines the vertices that are very close to each other that are creating those artifacts. So I can definitely do that before, and it just removes it. And you can change the distance between the vertices to remove those. So I don't really use that often unless I have something like that. So now you can have the wireframe after the subdivision. You can also do it with this one, because now it's not that bad when before we had weld, it was like that. You can hit shift and increase the weld until you get something cleaner, but sometimes be careful because it does ruin other parts since the distance is kind of similar. You can definitely limit it with the vertex group, so make sure that you're only selecting these vertices that you want to weld together. And you can also say only the connected ones. So if you have other objects next to it, that will apply to the distance as well. It's not going to weld them together. So yeah, that's another trick that you can do with modifiers. I like to replace the original most of the time when I'm using wireframes, and you get something looking like a greenhouse. You can definitely not replace the original and make it glass so it looks more like a greenhouse. And you can test other things as well. And you also get the material offset. And the material offset is going to change the material for the wireframe itself. So all of these wires, but if you have the original, it's not going to have the same material. Okay, let's hide this one as well. And let's go through a different set of modifiers. One of my absolute favorites is the curve modifier and the array modifier. And I've used them in a couple of thumbnails from my A to Z tutorials. Let's add a torus and let's go to top view with 7. And let's start with an array modifier. So what I'm trying to create is a chain curving on a curve. So what I need to do first is to create the chain. And to create that, I just use an array and I change the offset. So the relative offset is the easiest one because 1 meaning one of that object. And if I do 2, then it's going to give me the space for 2 objects. So what I like to do is 1.5 because I know the other loop probably would fit in between those two because I want to create another loop that is vertical while these are horizontal. And this depends on where you want the offset to be. So if I have this at 0 and this at 1, then it's going to go on the y-axis. But what I need right now is this right here. I will keep it at 1.25 maybe, and then I can increase it. And this, of course, is an integer because with loops, there's always an integer. You cannot count with floats or decimal numbers. And now that I have these, I can create another one that flips vertically. So if I shift D this and I move it on the x-axis just a little bit, I can rotate it on the x-axis at 90 degrees, and I think it probably fits nicely. Okay, it somewhat worked. And I'm going to keep it at 7 as well. And now I can create a curve. You can apply this before because now we have 2 different objects, or you can join them if you're joining them. So if I remove this and this, if I disable it, if you join these 2 objects, then you only have to take care of one list of modifiers. But I'm okay with having 2 different lists for now, at least, just to show you how it works. Now, if I add the curve modifier, it will ask me to create a curve or to reference a curve object. So I have to add that. If I go to top view, add curve, I always start with a Bezier curve, go into edit mode, select all, usually it's selected, and then hit X, delete vertices, and then I draw my own curve with the pencil tool. So I can just do this. Now I have a curve. I like to clean it up just because these little things can create a problem when it's at the edge. I can just delete it, go out of edit mode, and now if I go to this, select the curve, it's going to curve. And you can choose a deform axis. You can definitely change that. If you do it this way, then as you move the object that you have on the y-axis, it's going to move it and it's going to curve with the curve. But because it is already moving on the x-axis, I have to use the x-axis. But one thing I don't like about the curve modifier, and I prefer to just shape things myself because it does deform the shape. It's not that visible the majority of the time, but it does show for certain objects. So something like this does show very clearly. If I make it smaller, it's going to be less deformed. So if you're using this, either have less curves in your curve or make it smaller. So it'll work with things that are much smaller, like this necklace for notes on execution book review. Now I can select this and select these. We can do either Command L and copy modifiers, because I don't mind recopying the two things and overwriting what we already have. But you can also do Control C, which is something that you can add as an add-on, and you can copy selected modifiers. So I only want to copy the curve. It's going to look bad just because I have rotated that one and scaled it down. So what I can do is just delete this one and recopy this one. And now I can just increase the number. And that's what I meant when I said if you have a little vertex that is going crazy at the edges and you didn't remove it and you go over the array number, it's going to follow that final curve. And because my final curve is straight, or my final vertex is straight down, it's going to finish straight down. And then select the other one and increase the number. And now we have a chain. When you want to move all of this right now, you'll have to select everything, the curve and the chain, and you can move it wherever you want and it won't change. For the array modifier, there are other ways to offset. There's a constant offset, and the only reason why I would use a constant offset is if you have a specific size in centimeters or meters. So what I did is I've used this only once in my life, and it wasn't for any of the projects that I have on my Instagram. It was for a home project where we needed to know the arrangement for the tiles, and so I needed to know the exact offset in centimeters. And that's how I used constant offset. So it's never something I would use digitally unless you are working with something extremely specific like interior design. And then there is object offset, and this is depending on a different object that you have, and usually it's an empty. And with empties, you can create something circular. Okay, now let's remove, or let's hide these, also the curve. And now for a project like this, I have used the Boolean modifier. So I wanted to have a concrete square that has been broken, because in this book you do get a broken bureaucratic system. So I needed something concrete because that resembles the huge walls that they have around Area X or the walls around offices. And then I wanted it to be broken. To do that, you can use Booleans. So what I did is add a cube, and then I duplicated that cube and rotated it and made it smaller or bigger depending, just to break the bigger cube. And then I do Boolean with the bigger cube because that's what I'm trying to cut down, and use the object or the smaller object to cut the bigger object. If I go into X-ray mode with Option Z or Alt Z on Windows, I can now edit this a little bit because I get to see what is happening. I only need the corner to be cut. Now if I hide this cube, we can actually see it cut down. And then I added a material with some displacement. So the concrete is displacing it in certain areas and it's making it look even more broken. But for that one, so I don't have a lot of Booleans, because with Booleans, you get a lot of calculations that are going to slow down the viewport. I do apply it every time I add a cut. And you can also do union, which is going to add the two objects together. You can do intersect, which is going to only show you the parts that are intersecting. I almost always use difference if I'm using Boolean. You can definitely do fast until you render, and then you can do exact. But fast with something like this is going to look also nice. And you can also do a collection, but I've never reused collection with Booleans. It's always just one cube. But I think looking back at what I did before, having multiple Booleans, it would have been better if I just used a collection of cubes to cut the bigger cube. But we all learn from our mistakes, right? And I've made a lot of them in Blender. Okay, so with Boolean, since I said I've used a texture with a displacement, let's actually use displace because that's another one that I use often. If I go to displace and it's under the deform, if you're using 4.0, now the first thing it's going to do is just make the entire cube bigger. And that's because it doesn't have a texture. We have never talked about textures, I think, maybe in geometry notes, but if you're using displace, you're gonna have to know a little bit more about textures. If you hit new, if you don't have any textures before, and we don't have any right now, you can just hit textures and then you can go to the texture menu, or you can go from here to the textures settings and it'll take you there. By default, you're gonna have an image or a movie. You can just get a file from the images. You can hit new and create it yourself in texture paint. But what I like to do is use clouds or any of these. You can use, you don't have all of the textures from the materials tab. And that's why sometimes I just use displacement in materials. But if I'm using it here, I usually use clouds. And if I go to clouds, I can change the size. And you can actually see it's doing something really cool to it if you wanted to animate it like this. But because we don't have enough vertices, it's not displacing based on the image that we have. It should have a lot of indentations for these black pixels. So let's add a subdivision surface right before displace. If I want it to keep its shape, I can either do simple, which is gonna work, but you're gonna have to add a lot of levels to this in order to see it, and definitely do shade smooth if you want it to be smoother, and then add a subdivision right after. So we're doing something somewhat similar to the cloth modifier. We're adding a subdivision right before if you don't have enough, and then one afterward to smooth it down. And just test out if 2 is fine and 2 is nice. You can also do this and add a bevel right before subdivision. We're still gonna need a little bit more subdivision. So 4, and make sure that your render is either equal or higher than your levels viewport for your subdivision. If I disable all of these, let's make sure that our cube is actually nice. We can make these smaller. And now let's add all of this. So what is happening is that the displacement is extremely strong, and we can actually see this with the face orientation. If there is red, then something is overlapping with something else, or vertices and edges are overlapping. We can adjust this by reducing the strength. With displacement, you usually need between 0.01 to 0.1. So what I do usually is 0.1 or 0.05. 0.05 I think is my most used one, even with textures. And you can also change the mid-level. So right now it's at 0. It's kind of similar to the offset with Solidify. If I don't want the mid-level or the gray areas to be at 0.5, to start at 0.5, which is going to make my object altogether bigger, I can just do 0, and then I can increase the strength a little bit, which is going to give me better displacement. And then go to textures again, and go to colors and increase the contrast. The higher the blacks, the more indentation you're gonna get to the inside, and the more whites you have, the higher edges you're gonna have. So all of these going out of the original shape are the whites, and everything that is going in is the black. And then you can make it bigger or smaller. The smaller, the crazier it's gonna get, and the bigger. And you can build on top of the displacement with another displacement. So you can duplicate this, and it's going to duplicate it right after. And you can add a different texture. So if you want to add a new texture from this one, you can just add a new one, or you can remove this, create a new texture, go to its settings, because now you have 2. So be sure that you're changing the right one for the right displacement. And we can make this noise. And this will create these little indentations all over. I don't want to increase the strength, so 0.02 is fine, but I want to add more to the texture. You can also use the color ramp if you're using it usually in materials and textures, and if you're used to that, then you can definitely use that. And if I add more subdivision, then you're gonna see it better. We can reduce this to 0.01, and maybe put this at 0.5. And you can definitely reduce this by scaling the texture by using something other than noise, like Voronoi, for instance, because that way you can adjust the size and we can flip the colors. This way you get a little bit less, but it'll make your objects a little bit more realistic, especially with materials and more displacement even then. If I want to displace with an image, I use this. If I want to add some details to the object itself and apply it later on, then I use displace, of course. But if I'm going to displace for a material, then I will just use a material instead. And yeah, that's how you use Boolean and displace. The last one I want to talk about is decimate. And in order to do that, I need to go and create my text SVG in Illustrator and come back. Okay, I hit the cube and now let's add the SVG. Select all the curves, rotate on the x-axis, go to front view, and I like to hide the camera when I'm doing this. Let's make it larger. And I like to set origin to the geometry, which is going to center the origin for all of these. And then I like to center the text like so. Okay, the next modifier is my favorite when it comes to something like this. When I talked about inflating objects, I only remeshed this. But one thing that I like to do sometimes is to use the decimate modifier just to remove all of these triangles on the letters, which is connecting all of the vertices, I guess. If I change this into a mesh or convert this into a mesh. So if I go now, I can actually see that these are all vertices connecting to each other. Let's go back to it being a curve. I only use this if I'm keeping the curves or if I want to create a UV map that is clean, so I don't have to deal with all of these artifacts. So if I go to modifiers, and you'll notice that the modifiers have shrunk in quantity just because we're in curve mode, and curves don't use all of the modifiers that we had before. But right now, what I need to do is just to use decimate. Decimate is a way to unsubdivide what you have. And with something like this, I like to use the planar. And you'll immediately notice that we have a very clean M. And if I go to solidify and I add a little bit, well, that's not a little bit. If I hit shift and add a little bit of extrusion, we can do it here as well. But I'm going to just use the modifiers today. We can have a very clean letter. And now I can hit Command L to transfer data and then choose copy modifiers, and that will copy it to all of them. We have something weird over here going on, but I don't mind right now. And you'll notice that it reduced the amount of lines on it. Of course, you're going to have lines on E, on anything that has contours on the inside. So the E, D, and O, because it has to connect it to something in order for it to become a connected shape. If I'm remeshing it, I don't really need to do the decimate, but if I'm not, then this is also a good way to do it. And sometimes what I like to do is to use decimates and solidify, and then I apply it, and later on I can project a grid on top of all of these, and so I get a grid in the front. Keep your objects with these sharp edges for cleaner design. It'll allow you to pin objects better, to create better UV maps with that. But it takes a lot of time, and if I don't need it, if I don't need any close-ups, then I don't really do that process. But with this project specifically, I did this process. So I didn't remesh the objects because I wanted my edges to be really clean to pin them when I used the cloth modifier. I only projected a grid on top of these objects. So this way, what I was inflating had a good topology, but the rest, which I didn't need to inflate and I needed to pin easily, I kept it as is. So yeah, decimate is a really cool modifier if you want to clean your objects. If I go through all of the modifiers, there are some other modifiers that I use, but not that often, like the wave modifier, which creates a wave out of a plane. There's also the ocean one, which creates ocean water. There's also shrink wrap, which shrinks any object to another object. So if you want to add stickers to a complex object and you need the plane to hug that object so it looks like it's actually sticking on top of it, you can use shrink wrap. Screw I've used before with the curves tutorial. Remesh I have used a lot in many tutorials. Multi-resolution I only use with sculpting, and I don't know if you can use it in any other way, but that's how I use it. If I want to create a displacement map or a normal map for an object, like with this bag or with this necklace, skin is one I use rarely just because it doesn't really look good. But if you have lines and you want to add some geometry to them, you can use it. I prefer creating curves in Illustrator, export them as an SVG, and then add depth, because I like when they're beveled tubes rather than square tubes that don't even look good. Especially with corners, they never look good. So I don't really use them. And then mirror I only use if I want to create something that is symmetrical. So if I want to edit this cube, if I go into X-ray mode and then edit mode, go to front view, remove this half, X for delete vertices. And now if I add a mirror modifier and move it to the x-axis, I have to apply the location. And now I have it mirrored. And if I go to clipping, then if I move this, it's always in edit mode. If you want to move it, I keep forgetting and I have to apply. So if I do clipping, then it's clipping it to the center. So if I'm moving it, it's not actually creating a space. And now whatever edits I do on this edge, they're actually moving on the other edge. And that's how I use mirror. So if you like to create characters a lot, then usually those have symmetrical faces. You start with mirror, you create the initial look, and then if you want one ear, let's say going down, if your character has ears, has, I don't know, dog ears or anything that you need to adjust later on, then you can just apply the mirror modifier. It's just a helper for you to model something that has two sides once. If I go back, then there is also the build. I never use this, but it's a really cool one to use if you want to create an animation, and you can actually see the animation if you start playing. And it will build the objects for you. And depending on the length of it and where do you want it to start, if I do 20 frames, you can actually see it building much faster. But because it doesn't really have a lot of faces, then it's not going to work well. So if I remove decimate, maybe you can actually see a little bit more build. And for the modify parts, I only use mesh sequence cache or mesh cache by accident if I'm using Alembics. Alembics are basically animations that you bake and save. So if you have an animation for your object, you can save that as an Alembic, and then you can import it back with that animation already done. That I have done by mistake. I didn't know it added a modifier, but then I found out that it does. So you can either use it yourself or you can just import the Alembic and it'll add the modifier for you. And I have used the vertex weight edit and mix and proximity. If you look up vertex weight proximity on YouTube, you'll find a lot of amazing tutorials creating some incredible stuff with a cloth modifier. So that's something that is really cool to use if you want to, let's say, pin parts of your mesh when you're using the cloth modifier based on the proximity to another object. So how close that object is to certain vertices, they're going to be either pinned or not. And it's going to create a lot of cool effects. And I have used vertex weight mix and edit with the cloth modifier as well. This project, which I did at the beginning of January for the Martian book review, and I've mixed two different vertex groups, one that is empty and one that is pinned. and I animated that. So when it's falling, nothing is actually pinned. So it's adjusting to the gravity, and then I pin it back, and so it goes back to its original position. Yeah, and the rest I've never really used, so I cannot talk about, except for the physics modifiers. But those I don't add from here. I never really added any of the physics modifiers from here. I just add them from here. Any of the modifiers you add over here is going to be added automatically over here. And particles as well. So even if you add a particle system, it's going to add it to the modifiers tab. And it is considered a part of the physics tab. If you hover over any of the modifiers and hit X, you're going to delete it. And that's pretty much all that you need to know about modifiers in my workflow. And when it comes to my thumbnail, we basically created a lot of the objects that I'm going to use on that. But if you have any questions about any of the things that I've created in the thumbnail that you think I haven't talked about, then please do ask them in the comments below. And thank you for watching. Talk to you soon. Bye.